Yes.
Yeah, I hear you. Can you hear me?
Can you hear me? Sorry? Hello, Prof. Sorry?
It's probably, I can hear you, but not hear me. I think it's a problem myself.
No, that's what it should be. That's what it should be. Like attendees do not have to, they have to be on mute automatically. They can't speak. I'm saying if you can hear me and and that's fine because I don't need to hear you. Yes. If you want to ask a question, you put it in the chat. Or and can you try to answer a question on your computer? Like just write any random question. Yeah, try to write a message in the chat. Okay, I've seen it. Hello. All right. So yes, I'm the one who is going to read out the questions to the presenter. So every attendee is on mute. Yes, but I had put Jami as a co-organizer, so I'm not sure if she will be able to use that privilege to be able to speak and and control the chat box. I'm not sure. Yes. Yes, they are in. You can stay on, it's fine. All right. All right, that's okay. Thank you. All right. Bye. Allow mic. Hi, Jamie. Jamie.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you, Jamie. I was saying I'm not sure what to do in terms of, especially if people want to ask questions. Should I, if a person raises a hand, can I just give them the, like, unlock their speaker? Or we can just use the chat box for questions. What do you think?
Maybe if you first of all tell them how it's going to run, so the speaker's going to say their piece, and if they have any questions or any thoughts as they're speaking, they can put those into the chat box. And then when you have the questions section after the presentation, you can maybe start at the chat box. So if people want to, if you want people to speak, they can speak, but if they don't have their cameras on, it's maybe, it depends on how you would like to do it.
All right, that's fine. I don't know. Let's see. What do you think is the best way to do it?
I think it's good to have chats because people can share whatever they're feeling. Sometimes they might have readings they want to share. And then when it comes to the questions, maybe you and yourself, you and the presenter can read those together. Hi.
Greetings, Joshua. Hello. Hello, everybody.
Hello.
Oh, hi, Benjamin. Good to see you.
You too. I am here.
Yes, thank you so much for agreeing to come and present to us today. We
You're
really
very welcome.
appreciate it. Yes, and I would like to introduce you to Jamie. Let me turn on here your camera so that you can see her. So Jamie is my friend. She's based in South Africa at Rhodes University, and she's from Zimbabwe originally.
Hi.
And she has been helping me to put together this this whole idea about knowledge of Africa.
Which is a great idea. So nice to meet you, Jamie.
Lovely to meet you, and I think a big congratulations on being the inaugural speaker. You're the champagne bottle at the boat launch.
Thank you. So I have to
Yes.
break myself in half. Is that about right, Jamie?
No, we're just celebrating.
Yeah. So we were just
Where are you?
discussing. Oh, sorry. Yeah. No, you go,
I'm in
Jam.
London.
You're in London. Okay. At a wind farm.
I wish. It'd be really nice, but yeah, no. I'm actually at a cafe at Heathrow because my flight was late.
wow.
I was supposed to get in this morning, so it's kind of like, at least I have Wi-Fi. Yeah. So, but you might hear a announcement every 30 minutes for security.
Okay.
If you
Well, at
see
least you
something,
know you're
Jamie, you say
secure.
something. Yeah.
Okay.
I was
So we're
coming from
just
Berlin. We had a meeting on climate protection pathways. So there's studying some of these really wacky options like solar radiation management and stratospheric aerosol injection or cloud brightening, just to help reduce heat stress and other stuff like carbon removal, PEX,
Okay.
bioenergy with carbon capture and DAC and enhanced weathering. So, which could have profound
sounds
implications
amazing.
for Africa. Yeah. So, but they're really
Are you
risky. They're high risk.
Are you going to write about some of that?
Yeah, I think we will.
Awesome.
But it's not
Well,
in today's talk. Today's talk is much more climate equity, just transitions. So
Okay. Well, a foreshadowing of more exciting stuff to come.
that's right. And Jamie, did I hear that you were in Zambia or Zimbabwe?
I am Zimbabwean. I am currently in the Eastern Cape in South Africa.
Oh.
So I'm talking to you from a farm in the middle of other game farms. There's giraffe on the other hill, lots of wildlife around. Perfect
I'm
setting
jealous.
for hearing about the webinar.
Fantastic.
I think we also have Prof. Helika with us.
Yes, Prof. Lika is with us. So we're just discussing what's the best way to allow attendees to ask questions. Do we do it in the chat box, or we can allow them to speak? What do you think is the best way to do it?
Both can work well. Seeing people and having their videos on is always nice because you kind of get to know who they are. But it depends if they have Wi-Fi, and if they're comfortable doing that, they have really good Wi-Fi connections. So I think it's up to you. You could say both, Josh. Maybe we could say those who want to ask can, and those who are not comfortable asking or don't want to turn on their camera can put it in the chat.
That's a good
That's
idea.
okay. Yeah.
Can you hear this?
Yes.
Yeah, it's only like every 20 minutes, so and it's at least they're not announcing flights.
It's an air of authenticity.
Get my slides. So I'll just give a practice share.
All right.
Okay, standing by.
They should now be in full screen.
Yeah, we can see that.
Excellent.
Check.
And there we
Can you
go.
see Jamie?
It's still white, blank on my side. Maybe it's just because I have a slow connection. Sure, it will come. Do you have an opening slide you want to put up?
I have a title slide, but I think that was for you, Joshua. If you have a, what do they call that these days? Yeah, the opening slide.
The welcome slide.
Welcome slide.
Okay.
That sounds much better.
I'm just trying to. Okay. I think we can get started because it's now time. All right. So thank you everybody for joining in our first session of the Knowledge Hub Africa 2024. KHA is a platform for knowledge sharing between seasoned scholars working on issues relating to Africa. It does this through webinars and publication of short communications and documentaries. For more information about KHA, please feel free to visit our website at khaafrica.org. I shall repeat, khaafrica.org. So we really appreciate your attendance, and I'm sure you will benefit from today's presentation. The presentation will be recorded, so you will have a chance to view it for the second time on our website. I would also want to thank Professor Benjamin Sovacool, our presenter today, for agreeing to give a talk about energy, equity, justice on this platform. This is a topical issue worth discussing. So I shall give you just a brief background about Professor Benjamin Sovacool. Professor Benjamin Sovacool is a world-renowned scholar on energy transitions He is Professor of Earth and Environment at Boston University in the United States, where he is founding director of the Institute for Global Sustainability. He was formerly director of the Sussex Energy Group at the Science Policy Research Unit at the University of Sussex Business School in the United Kingdom, and director of the Center for Energy Technologies and University Distinguished Professor of Business and Social Sciences at Aarhus University in Denmark. Professor Sovacool shall speak for about 20 to 30 minutes, and at the end of the presentation, we will move to the question and answer session. If you have any questions as the presentation is ongoing, please drop them in the chat. And depending on time, we shall ask Professor Sovacool to respond to some of the questions. So over to you, Professor Sovacool.
Thank you very much. And let me make a request that you send me the easy questions and send Joshua the hard questions. I think that'll be a really good way of dividing up the knowledge exchange. Let me also apologize in advance. I am at an airport. I had a delayed flight, so you may hear some announcements that are not me speaking, but I'll do my best in American style to just speak loudly and to speak over whatever types of, distractions that may come. So I think this is a fascinating topic, and I think it's precisely one of the best times for a knowledge hub that deals with equity and climate change and just transitions. And Joshua, just give me a nod that you can see my beautifully green and blue slides. Great, nod received. So I like to start framing why justice matters to kind of preach a little bit to the choir. These are things we already know, but it's good to kind of put them into context. This is that we are in the middle of a climate emergency. We have an urgent need for systemic, widespread change when it comes to climate actions. And these are featured in almost everything reliable that you read, from articles in Science to the IPCC report, even to books that I've written with colleagues like Professor Van de Graaff that talk about how we need to harness multiple technologies to cut emissions as fast as we can in ways that we've never done before. And we have to harness a whole different suite of technologies, including those that are currently in use, those are like the best performing, those that we're just developing, and even frontier technologies like algal fuels or fusion. And the promising point is that actually we have a whole array of technologies available. That's a very young Benjamin Sovacool in that photo visiting Colorado, where the National Renewable Energy Laboratory is. That is a solar furnace. That is actually an industrial furnace that is powered entirely by mirrors, which needs no oil, no diesel, no fossil fuels. And this was available 30 years ago. On the right, you can see a graph from the IPCC report. This is from last year in the synthesis report that shows you 20 plus options that we have across all of these different sectors, from climate mitigation to forestry, to buildings, to transportation, to industry, and other, that is available today, not next year or next decade, but right now. And the size of those bars is how much carbon they can save. And the color of the bars, everywhere you see a nice blue bar, are things that are cost competitive or cheaper than we thought. So we can cut emissions and do a whole variety of other things, provide jobs, meet the SDGs, reduce poverty at the same time. However, it's not all good news. All of these new technologies, even though we need to adopt them, have hidden ethical and justice dimensions. Whether they're enclosing on people's resources or excluding them from the planning process or encroaching on other environmental goals like habitat protection or species loss, or they may be entrenching patriarchy, colonialism, racism, or other forms of structural violence. And we did a review in Nature Climate Change that looked at everything from desalination plants to disaster relief to coastal protection to even things like flood walls, and found that all of them created net injustices in certain contexts. It's also the case with things like disaster recovery. So after you have hurricanes and tsunamis and earthquakes, even in the global north, even in places like the United States and New Zealand, or also Southeast Asia, you see these disasters. as a pretext to capture resources. And lastly, and most relevantly today, we also see them with climate mitigation. We did a review of more than 300 case studies, asking a very simple question. When you do climate action, who is victimized? Who is vulnerable? And what you can see in the right, we cataloged in all of these cases, how often is the evidence saying non-human species, local communities, farmers, indigenous people, women, and you can see all of them have been harmed by how we decarbonize. Even those with disabilities, even prostitutes and sex workers who will follow wind farms and hydroelectric dams, and alcoholics, because many people cope with health impacts by drinking alcohol rather than going to the doctor. What's also quite striking in that graphic from the IPCC, the two biggest bars with mitigation potential were wind and solar. And you can see here, the two technologies in our review that were the most often criticized were wind and solar, right? In 50 and 38% of the cases, they're documenting injustices with those two forms of energy. And you can also see on the right, in a shocking number, you see all of these negative patterns of land grabbing or unfair planning or additional environmental destruction or the worsening of poverty. And in almost 30% of cases, you see all of these things happening together. So it's like a cocktail of injustice. I want to call out too the particularly devastating impact that some of these transitions are having on indigenous groups or ethnic minorities or Aboriginal groups or First Nations communities. We've documented in the evidence anytime that came up. And depressingly, the table takes me 3 slides to get through. And it is also a mix of global north, global south countries. It isn't just the global south. We also see a lot of displacement and indigenous injustice in the United States, in places like Michigan, in places like Canada. And you can see here, the list goes on. There's Canada, Australia, Canada again, and on. It takes me 3 darn slides just to actually make through, which is not a good sign. We also see tensions when we try to implement climate policies between these two goals of climate emergency and equity and respect for communities. We can do things that are really, really quick, but they're often unjust. Or we can do things that are really inclusive and participatory, but they take a huge amount of time. And it's very hard to find kind of cases of just and effective policies and programs. And if you know of any, this is a call out for the Knowledge Hub. If you can find us examples that meet those double criteria of satisfying energy justice needs and accelerated decarbonization needs, we're very open to learning from them. It also means that justice becomes its own contested agenda. And we have very different perspectives in the academy about incremental versus transformative justice, as well as kind of extrinsic and instrumental justice, or more normative and intrinsic forms of justice. And this leads to 4 very different communities, all of which claim to be speaking about justice, with different epistemic communities, different fundamental goals, different conceptual approaches, and of course, different ways that this actually shapes policy. So you can frame this in a way they say that justice is pluralistic, but you can also say that it is contested. It is not in the single domain of any one of these different groups. And we see this in my colleague Laura Conger looked at energy justice narratives in the country of Estonia, which is very fossil fuel dependent. They use a lot of shale and oil sands. And there, any way you move the transition is perceived as unjust. If you phase out of oil, then you lose jobs. If you phase in renewables, you have land use impacts. And if you do nothing, then you have pollution and dependency on a very polluting source of energy. So either way you move it, there's an injustice that someone can identify. And also with the call out to the global south, we're quite concerned that a lot of the mining and minerals we'll need for decarbonization will negatively impact communities. And so we did a study 2 years ago in Nature Communications, and we identified that about 33 million people will be at risk of coal phase out, but another 120 million almost will be at the risk of energy transition mining. And what's interesting is the people at risk of coal phase out are not the same. It's people like the United Kingdom and Poland and South Africa and Indonesia. But as you can see on the right of this graph, it's a new set of countries like Argentina and Brazil and Russia and Peru, which will be at risk of new mining projects. So it fundamentally shifts the global politics and the political economy of the low carbon transition, of who is hurt from coal phase out and who is hurt from new mining projects. And just to kind of tear out some of the disparities we see, look at solar energy in the US. It is predominantly adopted by homeowners who are also white and very wealthy. They even have twice the median income of all households, practically. So that's not an equitable adoption for everyone. To say nothing of some of the waste flows that are also being created, which creates a temporal injustice, right? Every solar panel installed today is almost like a ticking time bomb because it will have e-waste and other risks 10, 20, 30 years into the future that the next generation will have to deal with. And finally, on this point, we did a systematic review looking at cook stoves, solar, food sharing, and EVs. Many of these innovations being told that they need to be adopted in Africa, especially clean cooking and cook stoves. And we found that a lot of these interventions can exacerbate demographic inequality, whether it's by gender, or wealth, caste, or knowledge and training. But it wasn't just demographic equity. It's also spatial justice issues. Global North, Global South, urban versus rural, where electricity grids are and where they're not, where roads go and where they're not, where you have digital broadband coverage and where you don't. And then, complicating matters further, it isn't just demographic and spatial inequity. You also see interspecies inequities, whether it's rebounds in consumption or mining or the building of new infrastructure. And finally, and probably saw it coming, we have temporal inequity, which is where you compound risks for the future. So we have 4 very different processes that entrench inequity, creating this matrix that transcends demographic space, humans and non-humans, and intergenerational equity concerns cross generations. And to prove this, we did studies in Europe where you would think that transitions are being pretty well managed and are just, and found, in fact, if we use our interviews and our focus groups and our internet data, where we went to the internet and talked to people there who wanted to be anonymous. And of course, you can see, I realize I'm talking to scholars, we have some limitations with our design and that we didn't correct people's responses. And we actually, still had a bit too many expert interviews. But anyway, from that data, we identified dozens and dozens of injustices, even in Europe. This shows you those for nuclear power in France. And if you add them all up, the magic number is 120. So for low carbon transitions in Europe, which is very well governed, still gets you 120 distinct injustices that cut across different dimensions of justice, distribution, recognition, procedure, as well as many, many, many different technologies, including smart meters, EVs, and solar panels. And many of these, coming back to the Knowledge Hub, affect Africa. Many of these are at scales that are well beyond Europe. One of the questions we asked our interviewees, our focus group members, and our internet forum people is, where does the injustice occur? And everywhere in red is a low identified place that is not European. It is global. And many of these are in Africa. Uranium mines, meddling, flows of waste, and geopolitical implications like poor labor conditions. So this then leads me to the positive part. We have to have low carbon transitions that are more equitable, inclusive, and just. And the IPCC report that I mentioned has done a pretty good job. I really like this definition of a just transition. It is a set of principles, processes, and practices that aim to ensure no one is left behind as we transition to a decarbonized society, and no one is meant to be people, places, workers, sectors, countries, or regions. It's very inclusive. And the IPCC is also telling us that we have to be proactive at ensuring that we minimize burdens and adverse outcomes It is telling us that we have to respect underlying principles of respect and dignity and dialogue, democracy and human rights. And it is telling us that this will cut across energy and other sectors, land, climate, gender, education, poverty, and we must be proactive at redressing past harms. We've also looked at different just transitions frameworks, and they also tend to focus on all of these complex elements. So it becomes about what is morally right, becomes about political economy, becomes about who owns and engages in different transitions. And it also becomes about understanding power relations and maybe even fundamentally rethinking capitalism and our own behavior, because we are all perhaps unknowingly complicit in many of these injustices. I really like this. This was just released a few months ago by the UK Parliament. They have a Parliamentary Office of Science and Technology, and they surveyed the current state of the art on just transitions, and I really like it. It's just transitions at different scales, from individuals to regions and cities to the globe, and it's really about multiple types of justice. Climate justice, procedural justice, epistemic justice, interspecies justice, all of them belong on the just transitions agenda, and all of them can contribute to more pluralistic and responsive just transitions thinking. And all of them, as you can see here from the same report, can lead to better proactive outcomes that can actually benefit communities, households, and people on the ground. And I think because of this pluralistic approach, you see a global push for just transitions around the world. The IPCC report identified more than 20 just transition commissions, task forces, and dialogues, including the Just Transitions Fund and the Platform for Coal. And that's just the official policies. We also see a beautiful array of social movements, whether it's Fridays for the Future or the Sunrise Movement or the Pan-African Climate Justice Alliance. And this is already 2 years out of date. My guess would be that we now have twice as many of these groups. And notice how many of them are either global or focused on Africa, like the National Union of Mine Workers, or as I said, the Pan-African Climate Justice Alliance. Which leads me to a final piece of positive news, which is the power of social movements and social change. It doesn't necessarily rely on new innovations or policy from the top down. And here we surveyed climate actors who were actually a part of strikes in 6 cities around the world. And you can see all of the reasons that they're actually sticking up to try to shape climate policy or have solidarity with other movements or to be protesting capitalism. And you can see many different types of protesters, from those who are opportunistic to those who are more responsible and perhaps more engaged. And if you look at the history of social movements, of major social movements like anti-slavery movements or civil rights or reproductive choice, you can see as well, all of them actually had key multi-actor coalitions, and all of them used a huge array of tactics, which you see here. It wasn't just one tactic. There were boycotts. There was direct action. There was nonviolent protest. There was a focus on legislation. There was a focus on mass media dissemination. There was a focus on fundraising, and there was a focus on transnational networks. Even social movements as old as anti-slavery 300 years ago were actually looking at global transnational networks to mobilize to fight injustice. And I think with social movements harmonized alongside some fundamental changes in policy around minerals and resources, around free, prior, informed consent, around better consumer protections, and better financing models, and definitely better control of waste, we can really make low carbon transitions more just. And on this point as well, it brings me pleasure to show you that although I already gave you 120 injustices for European transitions, they don't sit by themselves. For every injustice we identified, there is a solution. So none of these injustices are necessarily predetermined or inevitable. And that doesn't mean that we abandon our low carbon transitions. I think it means we just need to include more just transition principles to make them more equitable. And this also leads me back to this post report from October that also talks about many types of policies that we can exist to minimize injustices. So to conclude, and open this up for discussion. I think energy justice and these notions of just transitions are really nice conceptual tools that the Knowledge Hub and others can use. And we're definitely open to broadening them out to go beyond just distributive, procedural, cosmopolitan, and recognitional justice. We welcome other types of justice approaches, maybe Ubuntu, maybe indigenous perspectives, maybe more Asian perspectives as well, Buddhism, Taoism, Confucianism. It's a really neat analytical tool as well for like engineers and non-social scientists to kind of better comprehend some of the justice dimensions. And it's a decision-making tool that we can all use ourselves as we decide what car to buy, what appliance should we get, what politician should we vote for, or where do we invest our pension. However, we also need to remember that these low-carbon transitions are not benefiting everyone. In certain contexts, often in the global south or rural areas, they are only resulting in more toxic exposure, more exploitation of labor, more patterns of unfair gender roles, more discrimination of ethnic groups and indigenous communities, and more patent destruction of the environment. And it's very telling that in our sample of evidence, it isn't just centralized sources of energy like coal, gas, and nuclear. It's also things like food sharing and cook stoves and smart meters and solar panels and batteries, some of which we're trying to use to fight energy poverty. So we need to be really careful about relying on some of these solutions without attenuating to their justice impacts. And also, it's not just technology, it's also governance and the national contexts and programs that are shaping how we're actually deploying these technologies. Small plus here is that the involvement of procedural governance and justice issues also points the way towards policy leverage points and solutions that we can use to make it more equitable and just. And with that, I really believe we can avoid what we've called the decarbonization divide, where we're at a real risk of Europe and North America decarbonize, but only by creating a divide where the rest of the world doesn't. And with that, I'm very happy to open it up for questions. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much, Professor Benjamin Sovacool. Mute everybody. So if you've got a question, you feel free to raise your hand and you can turn on your camera and your mic and speak. For now, we've got a few questions and comments that have been dropped in the chat. So we'll start by Friedrich and then go to Jamie. Friedrich. It seems we've lost Friedrich. Jamie, do you want to start? And then we can move to Emmanuel.
I think that was amazing review and very, very interesting. Thank you so much. That brings up lots of things to think about. I think one of the things I was thinking is that a lot of people seem to be doing their work in their little areas, and there's definitely a need to map. So one resource which might be useful is the Environmental Justice Atlas, something like that. And for me personally, I think I am most interested in carbon kind of climate stories that actually recognize what local people are already doing. So you would rather find ways to recognize that small scale farmers and how they are sequestering carbon rather than big projects, which are, I know in Zimbabwe, we already have a big problem with like vast tracts of land being bought for the reason of carbon. So I think there's a lot of these injustices that are layering themselves onto each other, that local people's way of life and livelihood are not being recognized, and then they're being removed from their own land for a sort of a little bit of a pie in the sky reason. So I think I'm most interested to hear from everyone or to find out more about that kind of work, which is recognizing what is already happening on the ground at the grassroots level. But thank you so much. That was great.
You're welcome. And I would second that, you know, one of the other problematic trends we found in that review, I only showed you some of like the connections to injustice. We also looked at author demographics. It's a lot of global north authors and a lot of global north cases, even when it's global north authors looking at global south cases. So it's kind of like a double whammy of we could really use more examples from the global south. And we especially need, I think 90% of the corpus of authors was in North America and Europe. So this is a real welcome call to include more members of the community to tell us what we don't know. So we're not just relying on another solar energy case in Germany. So yeah, I second that completely.
All right. Thank you very much, Jami. Emmanuel, do you want to ask your question?
Absolutely, Joshua. Good morning, if I may say. I guess it's probably later in the day at your end, but I'm speaking from Toronto, which is where I sit. I guess it's probably the same time as Professor Sovacool in the US as well. But anyway, really great pleasure to be here and to listen to the conversation so far. Thanks, Professor Sovacool, for insights shared. Looks like you were reading my mind, you know, when you sort of gave your response to the last question and you talked about representation of global south authors versus global north. Because what I was going to say is, you know, we're very familiar, well, I am to a large extent, about some of this, you know, disparities or even the spatial dimensions of you know, energy justice and energy justices from a multinational or transnational point of view, right? But you know, as you sort of alluded to towards the end, even within the research community itself, we're finding an underrepresentation of voices from the global south. I'm doing a PhD at the University of Toronto, and previously I did a paper on you know, pollution resulting from critical metals, which will be very significant in just transition, right? And what I found during that review with a couple others was that lots of underrepresentation of mining going on in several parts of Africa, and I feel like, you know, such underrepresentation would sort of have significant effect on, I mean, first, if we have underrepresentation in research, then it means that we'll probably have underrepresentation of growth in technologies, of, you know, innovation as well in Africa and all that, and even in the rest of the global south. So I was wondering if you had any thoughts on, say, personal interventions you are doing by yourself. I mean, it's great that you are speaking at a session that speaks to global south issues, particularly in Africa. But I was wondering if you had personal interventions you are doing, or even within the research community, sort of include or be more representative of you know, voices from the global south. I think it was 2 or 3 years ago when Reuters did an analysis of top 1,000 climate scientists from the world. I think it was just 4 of them, you know, that were from, you know, institutes in Africa. And for me, that was really very telling, right? If you had 1,000 top climate scientists around the world and only 4 from, you know, African institutes, what does that say about the nature of research in climate, in just transitions, and what can we do to make this better? Over.
Oh, it's a great question, and it's kind of like about structural issues in the academy, right? And keep in mind too that our review was of the peer-reviewed literature, so already that's a huge filter of cases, and who knows all the papers that were submitted from global south authors that didn't make it. And I see this all the time as an editor: is you have really interesting ideas from global south authors, but the writing isn't very good, or they don't have the resources to make the nice diagrams and all that. And then global north reviewers are hostile to the kind of global south, you know, authors. How many times? Even I am a native English speaker. Even I still get the reviewer who says, manuscript needs checked by a native speaker. It's like, I am a native speaker, right? So, but I think you raise a really good point about what can we do individually and what can I do. I think one thing is that we can have, you know, projects that try to involve the global south actively in them. And so right now we have one grant proposal under review, I can't say where, that half the budget will go to global south indigenous researchers. There's an indigenous global south lead and like a global north lead, and we co-create everything together. So there's a lot of mentoring and capacity building. And it's a $2.1 million grant. 1.1 million goes to the global south. So it's not like hand holding, it's like real, true engagement. And we think we're going to have as much to learn from them as from us. But those types of projects are rare. And we had to ask the Research Council for an exemption because they had like a 20% cap on overseas participants. And we're kind of like, no, the point of this project is to co-create with people on the ground. So things like that might be quite useful. Of course, bringing this up at conferences, having special issues that raise awareness of these issues and topics. Like, so we could have a special issue of a journal and say that it is limited to participants from the Global South. There's another kind of way of making sure that the record reflects more of those types of scholars. And then finally, and you have to be careful, because I know in parts of Africa and even the US, it's not safe to protest, right? It's not always safe to challenge the government, but I think you can kind of bring these issues up with your local politicians, bring them up with members of parliament, bring them up with people at your university about inclusivity and about making sure that we're more representative. We have a mission at the journal I edit to double the size of editorial board members from the Global South. We also have a goal to be gender balanced in 5 years. So here are 2 pushes to make it more diverse that we're trying to implement. So I think it's these types of things that you can start to do as a scholar, as a reviewer, as a faculty member, and as someone who's going to apply for grants, and maybe as someone who even knows people in power, is start to raise these issues repeatedly and loudly. That's pretty much how change happens.
Awesome. Thank you very much for that.
All right, thank you. Teboho.
Thank you, George. I have a bit of a problem because I'm at home and my kids are at home. So I have a bit of a long-winded question, so I couldn't necessarily type. But thank you very much, Professor Benjamin, on a very comprehensive presentation. You know, there are 2 questions. You know, one of them is how should we transition? Which, I mean, you speak about different frameworks and different options. But I think the question before that is, does everyone has to transition? Like, do we all have to transition? And the reason I'm asking this is because this is a very common narrative that African countries, or maybe even low-income countries in general, are the minority contributors to the problems of climate change in terms of, you know, emissions, the waste production, and all of those things. That OECD countries are the greatest contributors, and yet the impacts, I would argue, are more severe on low-income countries, in particular in African countries. I live in South Africa, where you may be aware that we have a big energy crisis. We're constantly dealing with energy cuts, and yet one of our abundant resources is coal. And so there are many communities that are relying on coal, and yet, you know, one of the arguments is that even if South Africa was to meet their climate commitments to the T, it still wouldn't make much of a significant difference in terms of putting a dent to the global problem of climate change. So really the question I'm asking, and this is a serious question, is should everyone transition? And I think this question comes from the original issue being that the Rio, was it the 1992 Rio commitments that countries made years ago? It didn't look at all the countries in the world. It was mainly focused on countries that were said to be the greatest contributors, i.e. countries that were advanced industrially. And so when the NDC came, the whole framework about nationally determined commitments, it was because, in particular, America did not want to rectify the Rio agreement. And so there was this idea that let's rope everyone in so that at least Americans can see that, oh, everyone is doing this, let's all do this. So I guess the point I'm making is that, was it really a reasonable or rational agreement from the beginning that we should all transition because we are all contributing to climate crisis, even though our contributions are very inequitable? And yet the impact of the transitions are also inequitable and are very severe on our socioeconomically deprived countries. I mean, it's obviously a long-winded way to say, is it a good idea that everyone should transition? Thank you. I don't know if it's the right question to ask in this particular platform, but also whether you're the right person to ask. Yeah.
No, it's a great question. It's one we struggle with, so I'm happy to give you my thoughts, although I have by no means like the answer. I'm reminded of E.F. Schumacher's discussion in the 70s about appropriate technology that sometimes, like say Nigeria or kind of parts of Africa that have lots of fossil fuel resources, what's most appropriate for them is to use those resources, hopefully efficiently, and trying to minimize oil spills and so forth. So I like that kind of notion of appropriate doesn't always mean renewable. Appropriate means appropriate to that country or that community. The UN used to use different language about 10 years ago, actually 20 years ago, that's how old I am, when they talked about climate change action, and they used common but differentiated responsibility, which implies that we're all responsible, but to different degrees. And a lot of those in the global north have the most responsibility, which is why we create things like loss and damage and technology transfer and so forth. And I think that that does mean, though, that the people who have to transition first and have the moral obligation to do so are the global north. They've got the resources, they've got the technology, they've got more wealth, and they're more responsible. And that will, of course, drive costs down, create economies of scale and learning and all of that. That should then, just like with mobile phones and the internet, make it much more affordable for the global south to follow through. Final thing I'll say, though, is that I think even when you account that some parts of the global south may have fossil fuel resources, it's becoming a lot more difficult to make the case for fossil fuels because of all the externalities. And it's not just climate. Air pollution, water pollution, land use. And some of these companies, they're not very good at governance. They're not good at communities. They're not good at their workers. They're not good with pensions and human rights and transparency and accountability, right? So I think there it's like, and renewable fuels are still free and they're smaller and more decentralized. And I've seen studies that talk about the 100 co-benefits to renewables: health, resilience, jobs, skills, on and so forth. So I think in most cases, the transition makes sense, even for reasons that aren't climate change. It makes sense for economics and security and community and growth and long-term sustainability. Because I do think even if you don't decarbonize parts of Africa or China now, by 2080 or 2090, we will all have to be there. We have to be net zero. There's no question, right? The climate can't take it. And I've seen studies that even say by the year 2100, by the end of our century, one climate change impact, sea level rise, could have 100 trillion in damages a year. That's all of the world's GDP right now. One climate impact in 70 years, right? So it's like, we can't afford not to do anything. So I think there is a compelling moral obligation that everyone has to transition. Renewables and efficiency probably make more sense, although there will be contexts where they don't, but the timing and the responsibility of the transition will differ based on our capacities and based on our historic responsibility. That's, I guess, is the best answer that I've got. But Joshua, Jamie, this is also a question for you. Is there one transition we need to do, or are there 1,000 transitions we have to do at different scales and cultural contexts? What do you think?
I think you answered your question with the last point. That one size does not fit all.
Fair enough.
But let's move to the second person, Friedrich.
Yes, hi. I hope you can see me now as well. Thanks for the great presentation, and also Josh for organizing the Knowledge Hub Africa. I had posted one comment at the beginning when you were naming the areas where injustices in relation to renewable energies are covered in case studies, and I wondered what might be a reason that the aspect of hydropower dams is not that much represented over there. And I even posted one option to answer that one, namely that there is such a big gap in temporality from the origin of the construction of the dam to the effect that becomes reality several decades sometimes after the dam has been built. And also spread much across scale. So for example, in my case, what I'm working on in the delta of the Volta River, the Akosombo Dam is built 100 kilometers upstream, but other dams are even further inland. So there's this temporal gap and also the spatial gap. Do you have come across other aspects that might be a reason why this is covered that little in your examinations?
Yeah, thank you, Frederick. Good question. Hydropower was still third after wind and solar. So there were still a lot of cases of hydropower dams having negative impacts on communities. Keep in mind too that our corpus was 30 years. And as you said, dams now take 10 to 12 years to build. So like there weren't that many big new dams that were coming up into the literature, whereas solar and wind takes 6 months to a year to build. So, you see every year hundreds of new solar and wind projects and maybe 5 to 10 big dam projects. That's probably part of it. That said, our sample did include all hydro scales, so micro hydro, pico hydro, small hydropower. So some of those were in our data set, and those can be built a lot quicker. But I do think that it's largely the issue of cost overruns and capital intensity, that even things like Grand Inga Dam being proposed for the DRC, that's like a 20-year project, right? And so these things just take ages. And so that's probably why they're not moving as fastly as the other renewables. Even though they may move fast in the future. China still builds a huge chunk. That's another limitation. Our study was English only. So again, we're looking at the scientific literature in English, which means there could be thousands of cases in China we didn't capture, or India, right, that were written in different languages. So that's probably another bias with our.
May I pose another question, which is related to the order of transition? It was very interesting to listen to the exchange of ideas just before I had been starting to speak. And I sometimes, because I'm in Germany, and I realized that being stuck in a carbon intensive system makes it very hard to go on a path of transition. I sometimes wonder if from an African perspective, it may not even be an advantage to be somehow less developed, also in terms of infrastructure of energy, because then you're not that much stuck already, and it's maybe then easier to shift to just and renewable pathways of energy production. And a real question now, do you have some examples on injustices that you covered that are stuck in your head from the African continent in relation to renewable energies and transition?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, Frederick. And I think part of this deals with what's known as carbon lock-in. Sorry for that. Where you get yourselves locked into carbon infrastructures, and you can break that lock-in. It just takes time. You break it with bicycle paths and mass transit and rechanging urban shape and form. Amsterdam's done it. Lots of communities in Europe have done it, but it is expensive and it takes a lot of time. The first thing I'll say is that even things that you think might be really benign, like bicycle lanes, even they have justice impacts. Turns out that bicycle lanes could create more traffic congestion. That's kind of one of the incentives to get people to use their bike. But that traffic congestion causes more air pollution, which then pollutes the bicyclists. So the bicycle lanes harm the bicyclists because they're breathing in all this extra pollution, right? So it's kind of these weird, or you gentrify an area. It's like the nice part of town has the bicycle path and the bad part of town has the train station, right? So you kind of, even these things that we think we want could have justice impacts. Switching to your comment about Africa, a lot of our cases dealt with wind and solar, but it's the usual things. Wind farms being built without local employment, or herding birds and bats, or solar panels that maybe had corrupt practices where people were siphoning money, or there was not, expedited permitting done by USAID that marginalized different community groups. And then we did have some African dams in the sample, which are displacing communities, disrupting communities. And then we had some stuff on cook stoves and household energy innovations that just benefit men, or in Africa, it benefits the tribal leader. He'll put solar home systems around his family and no one else gets them, right? So there's kind of disparities in adoption that are mediated by culture and class and status, which is not fair. You very rarely see the poorest of the poor benefiting from these interventions. So I guess they're shaped by class and income. So those are just a few examples that come to mind from Africa.
Okay, yeah, thanks. Thanks a lot.
Okay, thank you very much. For the sake of time, we're only left with 13 minutes. So I'll just ask Makweti and Teboko to ask you questions just quickly. Make it quick, Makweti.
Hello, can you
Makweti?
hear me? Good. Yeah, I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Just make it quick because we are left with 13 minutes.
Okay, thank you. I'll be quick. Sorry, I'll not switch on my camera because I'm inappropriate. I'm already in bed. It's late here. I'm prompted to ask because of Tebuho's previous concern and question, and her concern actually led me to look at the conceptualization, the theorization that we are giving to this term called just transition. I paid particular attention to Professor's definition that he highlighted there. And I could see from that definition that we still have a long way to go in coming up with what would be a globally accepted definition of what this transition means. What can it mean? What should it mean? What must it mean? In those three dimensions, then if we still at that conceptual level having this problem of defining what the concept is, I'm wondering how it can be achieved in practice with the concerns that Tebuho has raised. And it's not just in South Africa, actually, it's everywhere in Africa. So those were just my concern. I don't know whether I need an answer, but it's just a thought. Thank you.
I can give a really short answer. I agree with that concern. What you saw is the best we could do as of 2022 within a group of experts, but I think there's certainly more room on all three of those questions that you asked. So yes, I agree.
All right, last question, Teboko. You're the last one.
Thank you, Joshua. So mine is more of a comment. So one of the things that have come out of the conversations about the transition is how, particularly here in South Africa, how renewable energy projects are not performing well with regards to the social performance. So that human rights and social performance are very low, considering that renewable energy is in part about climate justice. So there is justice to that, but their social performance is very poor. So a friend of mine came up with an organization, the Initiative for Social Performance in Renewable Energy. And one of the things they do is to have a library of resources that speak about the different initiatives that are done to ensure shared value in renewable energy projects across the world. But I think maybe a bulk of their library would be based on projects in Africa or in the global south at least. So I'm going to share the link to that for people who may be interested in some of the initiatives that are being done around renewable energy and social performance in the global south or in South Africa or in other parts of the world. Yeah, so that's basically that. I'm trying to share it, but it doesn't go. Oh, there we go. So it's called the Initiative for Renewable for Social Performance in Renewable Energy. It might be helpful to have an understanding of how we can ensure the just part of the transition in low-income communities or low-income countries in particular. Thanks, Joshua. Thank you so much for organizing this.
Thank you very much, Teboho. Thank you, everybody, for coming. I would like to ask Professor Kikeleka to give us some closing remarks. Professor Kikeleka is the co-host of Knowledge Up Africa.
Good afternoon. How are you? Can you hear me? Okay, thank you so much, Professor Sovacool, for that really illuminating presentation. I don't have a camera, so I just hear my voice. I'm starting to work in the field of agroecology as a sociologist. I really find the presentation incredibly illuminating. And I've jotted down all the different articles of yours, which I plan to read in the next week or so. So thank you very much. And I really do appreciate also Joshua Matanzima for organizing this. I think this hub arrangement and the seminar series really has a bright future. And I think, Professor Sovacool, you've really kicked off the seminar series in an incredibly insightful and interesting manner. So thank you so much for that. And thank you for those who contributed as well.
Thank you, Kik. Thank you, Professor Sovacool. Thanks, Jami, for helping us organize this event. Thanks, everybody, for coming. You are welcome to. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye, bye-bye, Teboho.
Bye-bye, everyone.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye, Frederick.
See you.
Bye-bye. Thank you, Josh. Thank you, Josh.
You are welcome, Anotida. Bye-bye.
By Dr. Joshua Matanzima.
See you, my friend. It's in the middle of the night and I'm now tired. I want to go and sleep. Patience, how are you? Patience.
Hey, how are you? Good to see
How are you,
you.
Patience?
I'm good. Good to see you.
Good to see you too. You had a question and then you dropped your hand. I wasn't sure what was happening.
Oh, I think I got distracted.
Okay. All right. It's okay. See you next time.
Thank you. Progress. Bianca lo. Bilo. Bilo. Sendithumele ilokhu izeningi.
You continue. I could say.
Kuthiwa isavele zayithumela mhlaka-12 zakutshela ukuthi uyenze. And you haven't done it, motherfucker. So do it by tomorrow 10. Do it. Uwena uzangenzela. Uwewe uzangenzela. Aren't you worried? Lithini bophara. Ba right no phara. Aso statement sa go le sona mfana.
Ma'am.
Thank you, Mama. Uyabhale ehambelana lokuthona ufuna ukwenzani in the bank. Business banking. Otherwise uzathunyelwa enye i-reminder kaTesto. Guys, are you serious, huh? Ndawo yakusekela ngubani? Who is the God you are ignore when I was serving Slim Masenko? When I was serving Lantanda Nyonta. Tanda. What's up? Bro. No, since that thing and I was serious. Ding. Excess in the ding that. Ngakwazi abakunika isikhundla nje bayi-one because abakwazi njengani yadelegeta yini kanti indaba ungabalekanga lapho athi awusho ubabili abakufana lama ngatsho bememezela ukuthi asambe I think kule gap behind on something senza ngami ngithwala because kanje thina nami sithe sisevoting wena lokhana ngithi afo siyakhona nje ila-Alexis nokuthi ungathi hayi ema akho even if it's we still about this sesekuwo 35 minutes sisweni la sisuthuthi ngeke lanto uzama ukuthi iwede nokufitha ini ku-restructuring prove ukuthi wena manje iproblem ukuthi uqhuvela abantu abazona What? Are you sure about what you are fucking saying? The way it is, you have to look at that. How long will you sleep? Uthanguzi esakhuluma philangana lokuthi hayi restructuring vele abantu bazabe sifuneka what person kuthiwa imagine sethatha simhambise kuthiwa siyathatha umakhathi simhambise esiyeso hayi ndevele curious ngokumanzi manje kakwazi ukuthi umuthi kamakhadi yasebenza umuthi kamakhadi guys kumele akwenze wayegula guys emthole laba phela kumele babe restructured lina phela talent thina sengitalent beliza silima kanti uyasheka la kwi-system ucheka u-system wayne ucheka ne-system suphendukile nkabi endega uqinise ezane ezogayilwa nothi uyakufuna angibani ku-girls night out Ngiqale wamemeza wena.
You can't get everything right now.
Yes.
If you see yourself on that, there's something wrong.
What serious business do you have?
Sure, we still be carrying for this organization.
Really have a Zathi diploma liphela nini kanje? Serious? Wathi diploma inayo BZ? Enter trainings you have done. All right. Asambe phi? Uthini nje ama-trainings that we have done? But wabona avela ama-trainings la kulokhu zenini hayi kuthini but last year nabhala last year anti-trainings we've done sayenze yani ngiwathola ngaphi amnangungelo ngiwathola ngaphi vele kuba ngithi ungihambe uchathe internal audit ngenze kungivume lokho Bibi Asam hi guys so I don't even know what's going on. Khona ubhalela yiphi? Khona ubhalela yiphi? Nayo yodwa engiyazi. ngaleyo ukuthi if you're seconded and what ungayenzani so mbhale khonokho hayi angikwazi kuthiwa ngudingi dani senisubmithile ndawula nto engiyibhalile sure